In this brief lecture, I'm going to outline an introduction to oral history and give you a basis for work on your oral history assignment for purposes of our class. Now, oral history, we're going to talk about this in a number of different ways. First, we're going to define oral history in this brief lecture, why oral history is important, some of the things that you'll need in order to do oral history work, some issues that come up when doing oral history work, as well as considerations. And then I'm going to frame it in a little bit of a broader context too, thinking about not only considerations in your own individual work for this assignment, but overall in the context of oral history work and some of the future directions of the work of oral history, many of which are taking place at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. So first, what is oral history? Oral history can be thought about in three different ways. First, the recordings of first-hand accounts. Second, the process of making those recordings. And then the written accounts which are produced. For purposes of our class, what I'm looking for you to do is to have the written account that you're producing, which will be about the 5 to 6 page paper with the 3 outside references. In that paper, you're going to talk about and have a context statement which talks about the process of making the recordings. Now, you will also potentially have the recordings. I'm encouraging you to do the recordings with individuals if they will allow you to do it. I think you will get a lot more out of the work if you actually have the recordings and can listen to what actually was said in the interview multiple times. Anthropology is one of the disciplines that utilizes oral history approach. There are other disciplines that use this as well, including history as well as folklore. Now, there are a number of different things that you're going to need in order to do oral history. First is to have a person, and a person that is alive that you can speak with in synchronous communication, which means I want you to either be on the phone with them, on Skype with them, or ideally in person with them. Of course, if you're in person, with a person, you can see all sorts of things that are going on in terms of body communication, in terms of other things that they might want to make you aware of overall that you might not necessarily get on the phone or even by Skype or something like that. Now, you also want to have a subject matter that both of you, the person that you're speaking with, your informant, the person that you're working with, as well as yourself, are going to be interested in. If you have something that neither of you is very interested in, it's going to make for a very long and tedious interview process overall. You're going to need to have some form of environmental control in the recording, and as you might be able to tell, there's a snow removal equipment that's going on outside right now. Hear that? That's great. So there's an example of quality of recording and environmental control overall. Now, it can be that you have some areas where you have things that are potentially interfering with the quality of the recording, and this could be things like wind, children going around, animals, but you want to get in a place too, you want to balance out the idea that the person's going to be comfortable. I can tell you that I remember very fondly doing field research on the Tohono Nation and looking out over Kitt Peak where there's an observatory being built and speaking with a man about his experiences working on the road and ranching, and it was just an idyllic day in the Sifuertek district on the Tohono Nation, just west of Tucson, and 80s, nice little breeze, the birds were chirping. But of course, when I got home, my recording instrument picked up all of this and amplified it tremendously, made it very difficult to actually ascertain what had been said during the interview. It's always nice to have a pen and paper in case for some reason your recording device, whether this is tape or usually now digital, a lot of iPhones and apps will have these sorts of things. It's nice to have pen and paper as a backup. It's also nice because if you're like me, you are thinking about a lot of different things while someone's speaking, and maybe something that they say you really want to touch on with them, you really want to go back to that later on. And so you want to be very careful in recording overall. Now, with microphones, you can have these as accessories and add these in. Now, some recording devices, particularly if you're not familiar with it, you should become familiar with it. If you're going to borrow something from the library in order to do your assignment, I'd encourage you to go through and do a number of different practice runs. Make sure you have extra batteries if you're using AAA batteries or AA batteries for your recording device. Oftentimes, a charge on the device as well could happen. Now, transcription is a very long process. Transcription is essentially, and there are a number of different ways to do it. You can do transcription, which looks at really in depth turns of phrase, linguistic symbols, and whatnot. For purposes of our class, I just encourage you to listen to the recording again and write down what was said in the recording. Now, transcription machines can be very valuable. It essentially frees up your hand and allows you to work just typing without having to constantly go between and move your hands off the computer itself. And these are hooked up with foot pedals historically on tape machines, and there are digital versions of this as well. Or you can just work off your computer as a whole. Of course, you'll need a computer, and you'll need lots of time. Depending on your speed, I've heard anywhere between 3 minutes to do an hour of transcription, which is very slow, up to 15, you can get 15 minutes of the actual recorded time in an hour if you're really fast. But usually it takes you about 10 minutes to do an hour of the actual, well, it takes you an hour to do about 10 minutes of the actual talk between you and the other person. So you'll need a lot of time. And then you'll produce a transcript, and that transcript should be shared with a person. And so you're going to need multiple meetings. The first meeting to generally set the subject matter, what it is that you and the other person want to talk about. The second meeting to do the interview itself. And then a third meeting to touch base with a person, to share the transcript with them, perhaps to share the final report with them and get additional feedback, do some follow-up questions if necessary. Now, there are a number of different approaches to oral history. For purposes of our class, you may use either approach, personal narrative or life history. Since you'll be interviewing one person for purposes of our class, you'll likely not get into a topic area, but of course this can be part of a broader project if you're interested in doing oral history work in the future. So personal narratives are stories that individuals tell about their experiences or observations. These are eyewitness accounts of some event that is deemed worthy of recall. So particular historical events, particular changes in the individual's life as a whole. Life history focuses, shares the person's life story in their own words, and this is compiled by an oral historian over multiple interviews and allows for basic lessons and changes in life to be conveyed to individuals. Again, with topic area, you would have multiple individuals that you're interviewing around a particular issues, such as in Alaska, pipeline workers, community health aides, in a broader context, U.S. soldiers' experience upon their return to the United States from being stationed in various theaters across the globe, or my work on Tox Island Dam, the proposed dam that was going to be built across the Delaware River, and its impacts on local residents who were displaced by the Army Corps of Engineers and National Park Service under eminent domain. So these are all examples of different approaches in oral history. Now, why is oral history important? I think from giving you a sense of some of the work that I'm working on now, it tells these alternative histories. It tells the story of these individuals as they experience displacement by the park. It provides a different way of analyzing or thinking about historical situations in a broader context. And it goes potentially providing more depth or different lines of inquiry where state records have not necessarily been kept. And Monteith's an excellent example of this in his 2008 article on the Mischling, or so-called mixed race people in Nazi Germany. He looks at the experience of differently situated Mischlings in and through oral history. And he notes, of course, that in working with oral history, in working with people of various ages, particularly if you're thinking about individuals that survived the Holocausts, potentially survived concentration camps, or any other sort of management by the state as a whole, we're necessarily working with disappearing materials. That in fact these peoples can only tell these stories while they're alive, and it's important to go out there and do this work. And this allows people to share their experiences with you. It shows the value of their experiences in their relation to you and ability to share what they've learned. So it goes a lot to attributing some sense of value or self-worth in a lot of conversations with individuals. It also can be utilized for advocacy, and Kerr's work in 2003 is an example of this. It's in the Oral History Review, and he looks at homelessness as a phenomena in Ohio and how city managers are relating to that, and how how bottom-up approaches can in fact lead to a greater understanding of the issue of homelessness in Ohio as a whole. Now, there are a number of issues that arise in oral history, and Bill Schneider, who is the former curator of oral history collections at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, has written a number of books and articles on oral history. He is responsible for the formation of Project Jukebox at UAF, which is an excellent source. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. But he notes a number of issues that come up in doing oral history. The notion of validity, how testimony compares to other sources, and this can be internally. Are the details of the story consistent with one another? Is there a logical sequence and sound mind of the storyteller? Externally, comparing these accounts to other sources, and this is important to determine if the account is in fact consistent with that of others, and to gain cultural perspective on the story, to see what elements are emphasized, and perhaps find explanation for why those elements reappear in this same story or multiple stories about the same incident or event, how these events are interpreted. The notion of reliability, whether the same question is answered the same way more than once by the source, by the person that you're speaking with, and the idea of verifiability, whether it can be authenticated through either scientific or cultural domains of knowledge. And there are a number of issues, of course, that come up with oral history. Ours is a society which is very much based on the text. It's very much based on this idea of being able to see things. And this notion of literacy is, of course, bound up with this, the value of literacy as a whole. And it raises, I think, interesting questions about the value of orality, the value of societies which have historically not used written text. And then what happens when written text is introduced? How does that change in societies as a whole? And so, of course, when doing oral history work, we're not only making the recordings of these speech performances, which in fact come to represent that person, but then going from there and writing about that particular encounter. And so it's a tremendous amount of responsibility in writing out these different accounts and providing an accurate representation of what individuals were saying. Of course, the relationship between yourself and the person you're interviewing is going to influence the interview process. How well you know that person, how you've known that person, in what capacities, all of these things are going to come into play. Feldstein, in his 2004 piece, talks about and tries to compare and contrast the work of oral historians with that of journalists, and noting that oral historians, for the most part, don't necessarily ask the investigative journalist questions. They don't really push for answers. And so oral history involves really, and Feldstein sort of argues that oral historians need to be a little bit more aggressive with their narrators. But I think in the context of this class, since most of you will be working with close family members that you've known over time, you'll know where that line is in terms of when to ask something and when to potentially know that this isn't a topic that the person wants to talk about. Intellectual property rights become important in how the information is shared, how the recordings are distributed, and how the person is represented overall. Now, in terms of the future of oral history, we're seeing, of course, the movement to new forms of communication, which I would argue promote this idea of non-text based knowledge and transfer of information. I mean, this goes from early interventions like radio and television to, of course, the internet and the wide sharing of information and distribution of information. Oral history can help us to redefine communities. It can be used for activism. It can be used to define policy. And increasingly, we see a number of different sources and ways to represent history through the web. And of course, as I mentioned before, Project Jukebox at the University of Alaska Fairbanks is an excellent example of some of the high quality work that's being done with oral history and moving it to digital files overall. And there's a number of revisions that have been made over time in order to keep up with technology, because these things are not settled once and for all. And so the interesting thing about all this is that the recordings that are made, even in a digital format, these degrade over time. And so we still see this notion of text becoming really important in archival work in oral history, writing out the transcript and keeping the transcript and making sure that that transcript stays in close proximity to the actual recording. And so these are issues that Leslie McCartney at the University of Alaska Fairbanks Library, working with Project Jukebox overall, can probably discuss in a lot more depth if you're interested. Now, I hope in this brief lecture to have provided you with an overall framework of what oral history is, why it's important, some of the things that you'll need to consider in doing oral history, some of the issues and considerations that come up, and maybe some of the future directions in oral history that, of course, you are going to be contributing to, whether this is either something that you're going to use exclusively in your family or for the person that you're interviewing, or whether it's something that you might share with a local historical society or library overall. This is a very exciting assignment for everyone in the class, students as well as individuals, TAs and myself, that will be reading through these assignments, and we really look forward to working with you this semester and developing this work with you further.